All right, let's get underway if we can. We're drawing to a close. I have once more tied myself in Apple's ghastly handcuffs, so if things go wrong, I'll blame it on Apple, not on me. Okay, so we're into this section when finally we brought you up into the current era to talk about social implications of the technology that we live with today, but also to relate that to what we've been talking about in the past. You will have seen, I hope, in my perverse way, that one of the readings I sent you was not indeed a 20th century reading, but a 19th century reading by Alfred Marshall, and we'll talk a little about that. And we'll also talk a bit about visions of the future, in part related to airy ideas we've seen all along, and in part to notions of, which Marshall brought up and Cairncross brings up, of geography and place, and particularly questions of economic geography and economic reasons why we are where we are, including why we are here. Before I get going on that, just a quick point of the exam. I think I have the dates right, but you should always double check. We have reserved this classroom during classroom times during the reading week. So if any of you are forming work groups or study groups, then you can come. Oh, it's not 111, sorry, it's only 11 o'clock. So from 9:30 to 11, so in this classroom, in this time, on Tuesday and Thursday, this room will be available if you want to meet. I know 9:30 in the morning isn't the best time for everyone. And certainly Blake and possibly I will try to drop in once in a while just to see, not to answer questions clearly, but to clarify issues and to talk about points. In the any other business column this week, normally we get a few obituaries in the course of the term. This week, Jack Paul Tramiel died. Someone probably not enormously well known to you all, but any of you had heard of the Commodore computer before? So a few. It was remarkable. Remarkable, in fact, that it sold, the Commodore 64 sold 20 million units, 4 times the sales, this says, of the early Apple. And in fact, Tramiel himself had a kind of a key phrase, which he took out full-page ads. I couldn't find quickly online a version of the ad, but he used to say that Commodore ate the Apple. And so he was happily confident that this machine was going to push Apple, which was the sort of buzz of the news aside. Tramiel died this week. Also up in the news, also this week, in fact 2 days ago, the machine that he said he ate, the Apple II, was in fact launched 35 years ago this week. And that, in some ways, is what launched Apple on its way. We talked a little bit, very quickly, about the early days of the computer. That's Wozniak up there who really designed it. And the great myth is, of course, that this company started in a garage, which is really humbug. Well, in fact, Jobs worked for HP for a while and was a corporate figure. But anyway, another anniversary, kind of poignant in the week that Tramiel dies. And if we think, though, that, well, we can say happily that they were completely wrong to say that Commodore ate the Apple. In fact, also this week, an intriguing innovation which is simultaneously a step backwards. This remarkable computer that sells for $25 called the Raspberry, in part designed or aimed to try to teach young people how to program. And going back to the Commodore, in fact, it links to the television. So you don't have to, oh, sorry about that, let's try again. So you don't have to have a monitor. You can really, if you have a television, get away with just $25 and you have a computer, and as it says, it's not unlike the Commodore. So in some intriguing ways, it's suggesting maybe what we need to do to go forward is to go back to the past. So those are events of the week. But to our overall topic, this notion that Cairncross brings up of the death of distance. The idea that distance is no longer significant because we have all this technology that connects us instantaneously, so we don't have to worry about where we live. We can live anywhere and work anywhere. Place no longer really matters. And whether that's about work or whether that's about education, we can do everything online. So I want to talk about some of these issues. I'm going to talk a little bit, taking us back over the course to where we've met very similar predictions and why ours today should be any different. The Economist piece, you may remember, is called "The Revolution is Really Here" or something like that. Well, we've been talking about revolutions all along. And each one, when they proclaimed a revolution, thought the revolution was really here. But now in The Economist, they said in that piece, no, it's really, really here. So that was 1995. Some doubts about why that is necessarily the case. I'll raise some questions. And then ask, again, looking back at things we talked about from the very beginning, why are these kind of predictions still problematic? If they were problematic about the printing press, are they still problematic when we talk about the internet? And one of the reasons or the questions to bring up are our assumptions about information. The idea that we can live anywhere, that we can work anywhere, we can study anywhere, in part lives on an idea that all we need to be able to live, work, or study is access to information. And if that stuff can be shipped to us cheaply and instantaneously, then it really doesn't matter where we are. And in that context, I hope to end, if I have time, but you know I'm not the best at time control by now, with a particular discussion of our collective lives. That is, so what does this mean for education? Here we all are, sitting on this campus in Berkeley. We've talked a lot about the great picture of American destiny coming west. We are the future here in Berkeley. But there's a kind of question that I've raised once before and I want to go back to. Why are we here? Okay, so let's begin with this notion of the death of distance. Yes? Human. Yep. Yeah. I'm terribly sorry. Sorry, then it should be the Tuesday. I'm sorry, thanks, Eamon. Thank you for checking that. It's actually the Tuesday or Thursday of reading week, so I'll change those dates on the slides online. My apologies. So they're not weird days. They are the days of the classroom with me. Eamon, thanks very much. Okay, so to try to get on track, see if I'll do better with this. Okay, so books that have made this idea in one way or another that place doesn't matter anymore. Thomas Friedman from the New York Times put out a book that was a big sensation in many ways, saying the world is flat. Everywhere is more or less equidistant from everywhere else, and there are no hills to surmount anymore, if that's the older image. And that in many ways was picking up on a book as I moved into the extra reading, Frances Cairncross, and Jeff had shown a slide from her work. Remember, it began with the death of distance and ended as asked the question with world peace. Why on earth with world peace? And we'll get back to that question. So that came from Cairncross's book. She was editor of The Economist magazine in London, I think we mentioned. As she says, completely new. Well, the question is, are these ideas in fact completely new? But clearly the ones that you have all heard. That place doesn't matter, the world is flat, etc., etc. So Jeff brought up these various among the trends he was looking at, and among those particularly of significance are that distance is dead, and so in many ways is location. That old real estate phrase, location, location, location. Well, location apparently doesn't matter anymore because we have the internet, because we're connected. We're now eternally connected. So our question is to say, well, what do we think as students of the history of information of that? So, in some ways, we'll be looking back. In part, we'll be looking back once more over the history of the topics that we've mentioned in the course, but in part we'll also be looking back over the 15 weeks of the course itself to things that we've talked about before. And as I say, we'll be looking from, in some ways, our location and see whether that matters in the environs in the area of Cupertino. Well, we should remember, whether we look back 300 years, or I think I counted right, but even showing how my math is problematic, just 25 classes, that we met this quotation before from these three guys, none of them great futurists, none of them great technologists, in fact poets as Swift, as Pope, and John Arbuthnot, who in some ways are less famous but the more interesting of the three. And they were sort of playing around, and they came up with this paradigmatic verse for lovers, which is, ye gods annihilate but space and time and make two lovers happy. Well, that's moved out now, and everyone says, look, annihilate space and time. Once we've done that, everybody in different ways will be happy. And just to remind us, kind of as we head towards exams of things we've talked about before, you may remember, for instance, that when we met the telegraph, Claude Chappe made a very similar prediction, really about France, but he said the telegraph shortens distances and in a way brings an immense population together at a single point. So I got the telegraph. Now remember what his telegraph was. It was that weird system of towers with all little flags on top. But he thought that was enough to say that we now, as French people, are together at one single point. The whole width and breadth of France doesn't matter anymore. We met it in French, some of you may remember, with the trademark application for the balloon, or sorry, the patent application for the balloon in France. And again, in the application, this time from going from the nation, the grand claim is, well, the telegraph might collect the nation, but the balloon is going to connect the extremities of the world. They're going to come together. So again, we've seen this. And I will rub it in some ways. Morse, when he wrote to Congress, again, got very excited about this idea. And what we're going to do, well, exactly what Chappe thought we're going to do. We're going to make one neighborhood of the whole country. So get a telegraph, and no longer is America a system of divided states. No longer is it north and south and east and west. The telegraph will make it simply a neighborhood. And it keeps coming on whatever the telegraph you get. You know, when the train comes across, what we get, in fact, we get that 18th century phrase coming back again. The annihilation of time and space, no longer to make lovers happy, but in fact, to bring the American continent together. And the railway is going to do that. So the prediction that distance is dead, we keep on meeting, depending on whatever the technology is, someone will lay it on top, going, as the balloon did, so from the neighborhood with Chappe to the nation with the telegraph with Morse, but now we're going around the world. And I talked a little about England's colonial tendencies and its belief in some ways that with the annihilation of time and space, not so much that we'll all be neighbors, but more or less that England will be able to exert its control over anybody that it chooses to around the world. And you can remember the map that we had of communications, telegraph communications, so heavily focused on the UK. By the way, Adam, thank you for that link of your link. By the way, just as a brief aside, while we're talking about the telegraph, you may remember that in talking about the telegraph, this question of whether the telegraph will make us all free and will be open to everybody was countered by several people, including Henry George, who you read, who was making the argument far from it, that the telegraph is in many ways extraordinarily monopolistic. And what it did was give immense power to a very few people, rather than diversifying power around the world. And I came back a little to that question when we talked about search and how the different internet companies in some ways seem to be making us super connected, but in other ways seem to be agglomerating power. In just this week, in fact, Richard John, whose work I referred to, has written a wonderful history of the telegraph, but produced a very nice article, which had been from a speech that he had given as president of the American Business History Association, looking in fact at the reaction to the dominance of Gould and others over the telegraph. And the reason I bring it up, he has a wonderful series of cartoons from the newspapers of the day. This is a wonderful one of Gould, comes from the magazine Puck, great New York magazine. So here is Gould holding all the telegraph wires, going right and left, and on one hand, as George claimed in his article, you remember, strangling free speech, and on the other hand, strangling free commerce. So a nice sort of image of how people reacted to this idea of that concentration of communication power. He has another one here. Here's a nice one. This one is of Uncle Sam being strangled collectively by Gould and his ownership of the telegraph, and Vanderbilt and his ownership of the railways. And again, the idea that these two devices are automatically going to give us freedom, or are they actually going to strangle the country? And I rather like the way that in this one that the telegraph poles look a little like graveyard crosses, swoopily in the background. And just one more. This is a nice one again of Gould, his great claim that I never speculate. This now puts him actually inside the stock ticker, so controlling all the advice about stocks that anybody gets, so he himself never needs to speculate because he's controlling the money. So that's just as I came up this weekend, and I think they're actually a wonderful series of cartoons, but they also bear a little on what we're saying, this question of whether having these new devices automatically leads to freedom or leans in other directions. But when we looked at Cairncross, the last one that you had up, so rightly pointed out, because it's slightly odd, Cairncross predicts that with this new technology and the death of distance, we'll not only be able to get in touch with each other, but we will have this wonderful idea of world peace. Somehow just being in touch with each other, reading the news this week doesn't always make you feel that way, but that we're all going to be peaceful automatically. Well, these things, again, we met before. These two quotations are actually from when the telegraph was first connected between England and the United States. And the great claim was, it's impossible that ill prejudice and hostility should longer exist while such an instrument has been created for the exchange of thought. If we have the technology, we'll immediately have peace. Or as the ambassador said in his message, steam was the first olive branch offered by science, then came the more effective olive branch, the wonderful electric telegraph, which enables any man who happens to be within reach of wire to communicate instantaneously with his fellow man. And just having that ability to communicate instantaneously will give us the olive branch of peace. So again, Cairncross in some ways is picking up on ideas that have been around before, and we have to say, well, if they didn't work then, is the reason to believe they're going to work now. What's different? Not to say that nothing is different, but what is different? Again, AT&T, and we look at this with the telephone now, and we're coming in. Someday we'll build a world telephone system making necessary to all people use of a common language or common understanding, and Jeff talked a little about that question of whether it really will produce a common language, which will join all the people of the earth. Fair enough, maybe telephones can be said to do that now, but suddenly it becomes into one brotherhood. There will be heard throughout the earth a great voice coming out of the ether which will proclaim peace on earth and goodwill to all men. So that's in fact what you'll hear when you pick up your telephone. Or maybe it will be the ringtone will be singing peace on earth to all men. So we've seen it, and once more with a figure who became very much a guru in the 20th century, making this idea that we've heard before about the neighborhood. Now it's the village. It's this kind of nice look back to a past when everybody lived in peace and harmony together. So thought in the village, and so McLuhan came up with this idea of a global village. Okay, so just in the course of this course, we've come upon this kind of prediction again and again, which should, in some ways, I hope, put us in a position to judge whether when someone makes these sort of claims today, about the death of distance or world peace, or the two being tied together, we should be in some sort of a position to judge them. And in fact, if you look at the reading the Economist piece, suddenly distance no longer mattered. This was 1995. We've got a long way to go, but already enormous confidence. And the phrase that in some ways has haunted us throughout the course, the revolution. And we met that word revolution again and again and again. Remember, Jacques Ellul gives hundreds of examples of it. We met it from the 16th century on. Finally, Cairncross says, no, but those weren't real, but this is the revolution. And it begins at last. I say Cairncross because although this was an editorial in The Economist, she was the editor, and I assume that she wrote the piece. And she sort of acknowledges this has been predicted before, but the difference is And she gives no substantive account of what the distance is. She just says, no, this time it's really happening. Now, you can't imagine really going back across time and meeting all those people who made a similar prediction and say, oh, no, it isn't really happening, I just happened to say it. Because everybody thought it was really happening. The question is, are we in a position to judge? So one of the ways in which we want to look at that was, again, embedded in the reading, and it came from Alfred Marshall. Dare I ask, how many of you looked at the reading? We'll get back to that a little later. Okay, so Alfred Marshall, anybody know who Alfred Marshall is? Heard of him before? There are economists in the room. Are they going to keep their hand down? Okay, I shamed you in speaking up. Okay, who was Alfred Marshall? He was the beginning of neoclassical economics at the end of the 19th century. He's a strange bloke who has romantic stories told about his childhood, which were later kind of revealed that it was a slightly tougher and grubbier childhood. Went to Cambridge and then to Oxford. Became an economist, sort of in despite of himself. He was much more religious at first. But what he thought he saw was that the patterns of people's behavior could actually be mapped mathematically. And so he's the person that's given us what I'm sure at least you know is the phrase, if not you've actually known the mathematics of, the supply curve and the demand curve, and the idea of supply and demand and the curves that meet each other. He's the man that began it all. In many ways, like Adam Smith before him, he's remembered for his mathematization of the field, but in fact he also had a very large sort of humanist aspect of the field that he said, it's not just the war of all against all. And we'll talk a little. Jeff, you go ahead. He gave the phrase free enterprise, an important matter. But he had some cautions about it too. He also, and was maybe important if we get toward the end of it, he was, in some ways, from very early on, he was at an admirable university, which has many wonderful graduates, called Bristol University. He taught there, and in fact, he taught in what was the equivalent of the extension school, and was very much insistent that that be open to women and women's education. And at the time when the British universities were excluding women, he said, no, they must be educated. On the other hand, which is slightly problematic, but we'll get to this later, he actually also, although he was very keen that they should be able to take the courses, he was less keen that they should be given degrees, which is an interesting and problematic. Just as an aside, a few years ago, a very elderly and very distant, connected by marriage, a relative of mine had, I think, her 100th birthday, and everybody was sitting around, talking and chatting, and suddenly went quiet. This woman walked out on the stage. Nobody knew who she was. She wasn't a relative. She wasn't a guest. She walked out in the middle of the room, and she said, you don't know who I am, but I've come here to give Amy, whose birthday it was, her university degree, because she in fact attended Cambridge before 1920, went through the whole book, but at the time they didn't give women their degrees, so on her 100th birthday Cambridge gave her degree to acknowledge the work she'd done, but at the same time acknowledging the fact that universities in general didn't give women degrees in the UK. The States much better, sorry, University of Missouri was doing it from 1840 or so. Anyway, that's Marshall, and what we're looking at today is that he is asking this question about how people locate industries and business. And what he talks about, and it's a wonderful piece to read, I do encourage his writing is very smooth. He said, look, how over time industries have concentrated themselves in certain regions, whether it's because there are natural resources there like oil or steel or iron, or whether it's because certain communities of artisans have all worked together there, or whether it's just because both the customers and the builders are all in the same place. But he said, over time, that concentration, that clustering is probably going to change. Every cheapening of the means of communication, every new facility for free interchange of ideas, alters the actions that tend to localize. So our idea that place matters, again, is going to be changed in the economic sphere by the fact that the means of communication have broken down. Okay, so we have that idea, going back to Marshall, going back earlier, that with good communication, place will matter less and less. And there are some interesting ideas and questions that come up that just say, well, do we really believe that? And what are the pressures that we have to take into account? One issue that came up, as Jeff was talking last time, was about Apple. Apple, in some ways, is a paradigmatic business, and it has disaggregated its supply chain. It said, look, we used to build things in Cupertino, but now we just keep the headquarters there, but everything, in a way that goes into an Apple computer, can be selected from anywhere in the world on this new idea of the supply chain. We'll assemble it in some other location, and in fact, it may never pass through the hands of anyone working from Apple. It may simply be shipped in a box to you if you order an Apple computer online. And Dell, for a long time, used to boast that it never saw or touched Dell computers, that they came simply from suppliers, were assembled somewhere else, and sent around. So, there, in some ways, that's an important notion of Apple and of the modern business, and Jeff talked about that. But in fact, Adam brought up the interesting question, well, why do we have Apple stores then? If you're disaggregating and if you can sell everything online, isn't it kind of retrospective, or retrogressive rather, to go back and start opening stores all over again if you're a little mom and pop business? And Marshall talks a little about the nature of shops in there. So one question is, well, what is the Apple shop doing, and why indeed do Apple stores exist if we're disaggregating the supply chain and can get everything from anywhere in the world? And indeed, what's interesting even about the supply chain, this was Paul Krugman in the New York Times, well, it's on his blog, in fact he wrote an article about it too, saying, look, we can think of these global supply chains, and that stuff that comes in our computers can come from China or wherever, but actually when you look at them, what you discover is that those suppliers all tend to concentrate in very small areas. They're not spread out all around the world. They're all the different parts of suppliers. And Dell used to insist that its suppliers set up operation within certain distances from one another. So although it seems to be global because it's in China, when you look at China, in fact, they're very tightly concentrated. So the idea of globalization looks a little strange. On the other hand, that comes up against certain economic challenges. And Jeff again volunteered that I would talk about this, so I will talk about it. The theory of the firm, put up by Ronald Coase, Nobel Prize-winning economist. I only have one date there because although he's 102, he's still alive. He threw a great challenge to economics because with that phrase that Jeff brought up, the notion of the free market, and the idea that the market is the ideal form of exchange, and these were two, he, Coase and Hayek, the great free market economists, were both at London School of Economics together, and Hayek was saying, look, always give power to the market, don't intervene, don't let governments get in the way, that a market is where the power is, governments just try to control things from on top. And Coase said, well, look, if that is so significant, why do we have firms? Why do we have businesses? Because they in many ways look very like states. They have someone in top who's allowed to give orders and everybody is meant to obey. So if the market is so wonderful, why should we have firms? And as we look at things like the Apple chain, one reason is to say, why is there still Apple? Why isn't just everything disaggregated, and why don't we go online and just buy the different parts? Mike?